Good morning, Nick.
Good to see you, Matt.
Good to see you as well, and welcome to all those out there watching our talk. And Nick, I wanted to tell you some good news. We are over 10,000 subscribers to Vogue Academy Talks on YouTube. And Kim looked this up. We are now officially micro-influencers. So that's something to celebrate.
That's all I've ever wanted to be.
Right, a micro. I don't want to be macro, super, whatever the other, the tiers. I want to be micro.
Minnow. I'm the minnow influencer. Yes.
Right.
Okay.
I feel like we're micro influencers with a macro impact. That's what we go deep in order to really have an impact on individual lives.
We're a scalpel, not a Swiss Army knife. That's right.
Right. Anyway, all right. Well, today we thought, or we're going to talk about critical thinking, and it's one of those terms that's tossed around, and then we want to pause and actually ask, well, what is critical thinking? And then the question becomes, its relevance and also the ability to teach it, because that is something that we, is espoused in. That schools, especially institutions, higher ed institutions, should be teaching critical thinking skills, and because it's so important to what people do post college. So anyway, yes, Nick, go ahead.
I'm going to add just one point to that. I think we're actually interested in people learning it.
Right.
So sometimes we talk about teaching it and act as if that's how people learn everything. That's not true. What we're concerned with is how people learn it. And what's the role of teaching in that? And that'll prefigure in my points to be made later of some of the key elements of critical thinking. So I just want to lay that marker down.
And just so folks know, an article that Nick and I both read to kind of get to help us on this topic was by an author named Daniel Willingham, and it's called "How to Teach Critical Thinking." You know probably more about him than I do. Do you want to speak a bit about that, the article, and obviously we want to give a definition of critical thinking?
Yeah. So very prominent cognitive psychologist, one of the most. He's written about reading. I don't fully agree, but okay. He's a cognitive psychologist, so that's going to be the focus and the strength and the angle that he's going to adopt. He's famous for in my little world. He's famous for a couple of pieces. One that critiques learning styles as a concept, as a construct. That's commonly used. I'm visual versus auditory, and saying, so he used his critical thinking along with a group of other people, other prominent cognitive psychologists, really challenging that, trying to put that to bed. Similarly with, like I said, this book, a couple books on reading. And then he's also been a prominent writer in some really influential kind of survey or summary articles on cognitive processes in learning, and mostly school learning. And so he's been very influential, and he does, of course, lots of other things. I mean, he's widely public. But so he's a deep, profound scholar, but also he has made forays into more general popular discourse. He's good at that.
Cool. All right. So like I said, we read this article on how to teach critical thinking. I thought it was, it was challenging to me. I was really, kind of blown by some of his claims. Would it be good for you to just start off and give us a definition of what you take to critical thinking to be?
Well, I think he defines it in ways that I think are kind of interesting too. I guess one thing I would start to say is there is a background that he gets into in the middle of maybe the first third of the piece that he's arguing against implicitly. So there's a long-held belief that critical thinking is a sort of unitary capability that people can apply, that regardless of your expertise in some domain or discipline, you're a critical thinker, and that what you want, and this is something that's distinct from knowledge, the knowledge of the domain, so knowledge structure about the system or whatever you're studying, about the conventions of how people talk about it, that doesn't really exist. So the classic example is if you want people to be analytical and critical, you teach them Latin or geometry. Right. So this was held for a long, long time, and there's no evidence for that. and people still believe it. They still act like it's true. And then if you're a good chess player, you're going to be a good general, something like that, which there's no evidence for. So that's the idea of transfer of critical thinking, which feeds back onto then this, I would say, a reification, this kind of creating this thing called critical thinking that is an abstraction and people have it. And so I would go further than him and say that's not true. We really want to talk about, and it's going to sound like semantic parsing, thinking critically. Because as soon as we talk about critical thinking, then we have this tendency to reify it and say it's a thing, it's an ability, people have it, and then you can apply it. And the evidence doesn't support that. I think we might be able to say, well, is there motivationally something that is transferable, or some other aspects that are transferable that people are trying to get at? But cognitively, critical thinking crucially depends on knowledge of the domain.
Right.
Second, it's dependent on knowledge. It's domain specific. It has to be effective. It's built into the definition. Isn't critical meaning taking something apart? It's taking something apart for some useful, effective purpose. And I would actually, I'm not sure I fully agree with that. I think that's presupposing the outcome or the use of critical thinking in ways that we want. And to say we want people to think critically, so that I'm already critiquing, so forgive me, but we want people to think critically in the ways we want and come to the conclusions we want. And when they do, that's critical thinking. And so when students don't do that, they're not thinking critically. I'm like, what about when I think students are super critical about teaching and schools and grades. We just don't call that critical thinking because we don't like it.
Right.
But it's critical thinking. Why are they critical thinking there and not history? Well, they're motivated.
So can I ask a question then?
Yeah.
Because thinking about, trying to really hone in on a good definition of critical thinking.
Yeah, go for it.
It seemed like one of the components is the capacity to suspend deeply held beliefs.
Yeah.
Right. In order to evaluate those beliefs in relation to other beliefs. Is that kind of a component of critical thinking?
I think that's right. And
Yeah.
that's what particularly if my beliefs align with that of the discourse that I'm reading. It's really easy then to say, oh, yes, of course, we agree. Yeah, of course, that's right. So it's really hard to challenge your assumptions when they are manifest in the thing that you're reading, and also if that coming from an authority.
Right. Okay. So then, all right. So then that's one component of. Sorry, I didn't mean to disrupt.
No, that's great.
Great
question.
I just wanted to. So do continue. What? So we're getting closer to. So one component of critical thinking is the ability to kind of suspend or hold various beliefs. At a distance, so that we're not emotionally or motivationally attached to them in a way that would make us unable or unwilling to reflect on them.
Yeah, and I think I might even go a little further. I think that you have to surface a lot of these things. These beliefs are tacit often and assumptions. So you actually, in yourself and in the material you're engaging with, actually have to be surfaced.
Right.
And then the thought is and that's a kind of analysis, right? But he doesn't use that word very much, but to think analytically. And I think for most people, critical reading, for instance, it's not critical thinking, but would include an evaluative component too, which I don't exactly see him saying.
Right.
But in general, so I'm a reading specialist. So if you say critical reading to me, at some point that means a judgment, an evaluation, discernment.
Right.
It seems like he's described that could be. I don't think he would disagree with that. I think it's just not definitive for his definition of critical thinking. But it would be for mine, I think.
He also said that the ability to kind of unearth or excavate the assumptions is domain specific itself. Do you agree with that? I wondered about that. It seems like that ability can be like, if I don't know anything about science, well then how can I, or like this, the specific field in science, how can I even try to unearth the assumptions? But I'm like, well, it seems like, okay, yeah, that in that field, but that's so
but you're putting
so specialized. Yeah. Right. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, you're putting a finger on something I was grappling with this morning as I was thinking about preparing for this. And because I was trying to think, I tend to agree from a cognitive perspective that certainly at a university level where we're creating knowledge and the kind of knowledge we're talking about, you have to have a lot of knowledge to think critically, effectively, accurately. And so that's why it doesn't transfer very well, why it's domain specific, it's knowledge dependent. However, I do think the disposition can transfer. And he doesn't really talk about that. And I also think the motivation, like, I like being a contrarian. That's helpful for critical thinking. It's unhelpful for other things.
Right.
So I have a motivation, I have a disposition, I've done it enough to see the value. We're off in universities, you're often seeking novelty. That's one of the features of critical thinking. Well, those are value laden, a lot of that, or motivational. These are different dimensions besides the cognitive, right? So I think from what reading of the literature, my observations, it is the ability to do it well is knowledge, but the ability to understand what critical thinking is, having had an experience that it's useful, I can say, in my field, people have all these misconceptions. They've bought and imported all these assumptions uncritically. It leads to these problems. I bet that's probably the case in this other field too. Like that doesn't seem like that is a cognitive process.
Right.
And it's not it doesn't get you to what the critique is, but it certainly makes you open to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I don't think he talks about that very much.
Right. No, I agree. Yeah, and I was also thinking like I feel like there's times when to your point, like you can get so immersed in the field that these assumptions just get buried deeper and deeper to the point where that just becomes wholly your perspective. And so someone who's relatively new to the field can come in and say, "What about this?" And you become so like crusty in a way in these acceptance of these assumptions that you've lost the ability to see things with fresh eyes or critically.
Yeah, crusty is a good word. I like that. You're kind of stiff. Well, and I think one of the things I might add there, again, because there's a lot of complaints, students aren't critical thinkers, and he kind of mostly agrees, but then he says there's more potential. But I think too that a beginner can have the awareness that something isn't quite right. What they're not equipped with is to make a cogent argument to persuade you, and then particularly about the deep roots of your discipline. So we see this a lot. The students say, my professor said I could write about anything I wanted, and so I took this contrarian view and I wrote about it and I got hammered. They were lying. They don't really want me to think critically. And I've concluded that no, they just haven't equipped you to make a critical argument, because the class is usually about one approach, not the counter to that approach that would then equip you, or certainly less so. So you're just never going to win that argument. And if the professor or the reader doesn't really take that into account, then it's going to look like that. And so I think this might be manifest here. Again, people are maybe more critical. Their intuition or their sense is like, that doesn't sound right. Or why do you think that? But they're not really able to unpack why relative to that domain, because they don't know that domain. If that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Because I think the ability to kind of sense, I use that like an inconsistency,
right,
or a contradiction, I think is really, that doesn't need to be domain specific. But your point that, well, then to somehow flesh that out and then make a counter argument to the professor's point of view, that takes training. And so interesting. Yeah, that's really good. So I wonder, like, and it's so fascinating because what is that ability, or what is activating in the first year student to challenge, to sense a contradiction or inconsistency, whatever. Does that make sense? Like, a lot of people just come in and just say, well, just tell me, you're the expert,
right,
just tell me. And then you have a few students who are saying, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense to me.
Right.
What's going on inside them, do you think, that allows them to see that?
Well, I love it. See, this is something I think that's not talked about. And I thought
Right.
it was something, when I was like, I wonder what Matt's going to say about critical thinking
Right.
from the existential, and me too, self processes. And so I did that. I think that's a great question. I mean, if I plumb my own experience, a lot of that was just being a kind of a pain in the ass contrarian.
Right.
To be frank,
Right.
I was just authority, author. So my stance was kind of contrarian, and I'm not sure that's really critical thinking itself, but it helpful for critical thinking,
Right.
not helpful for other things, but it's a disposition, right? That starting disposition, just to say, I don't believe you, I'm not persuaded, I'm as smart as you, maybe there's some of that, or I'm smarter than you. So that's the right? I'm smarter than you, or so there's probably some of that, the self concept, sense of self. I think there's I think another maybe less neurotic explanation might be something like a desire to understand, which we might distinguish from, and I've been thinking about this lately, a desire to comprehend, um, and a desire to analyze. And so if those are different levels, comprehend, kind of understand, and then analyze, if we can imagine those as different levels of knowing, different ways, and therefore different ways of knowing, then I could imagine that a desire to understand and analyze could lead to critical thinking more, and comprehend less so. What did they say is one thing, but what is the logic of what they're saying? That's understand. How does it fit together? And then, does that make sense?
Well,
And if I
yeah,
have that inclination, then
right.
this leads to critical thinking. But
Oh, like a kind of want to for coherence. Is that what you're saying?
it's a great way of saying it.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's true. Like I remember, I've given talks at Christian groups on campus a long time ago. And I remember one time I said this. I said, don't seek God per se, because people, I said, seek truth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's my belief, if you seek truth, you'll find God. But if like if you're just seeking God at the expense of truth, then you're opening yourself up
Mm.
for all kinds of
Mm.
distortions and bad
Wow.
beliefs and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so and so here, it's the student who has the want or the desire for truth that's going to want coherence and whatnot. And so and you're willing to put yourself on the line, like when something seems incoherent or whatever, you're willing to raise your hand and say, wait a minute, that doesn't quite make sense, because you're really, because a lot of other students, they might sense it, but they don't want to look like they don't want to ask a question because they don't want to look stupid in front of other
Right.
people, and so they're just gonna like, but it takes this sort of courage, but it's
Mm-hmm.
more like you just so want the truth that how you're perceived by others, all those things that tend to inhibit us, those are, you tend to just blow through those because, well, I want this to make sense to me. And so I'm willing to ask questions, and who cares what people think of me, and especially my professor. Um,
Right.
yeah, I know that seems the disposition that's going to make you more of a critical thinker.
Yeah, I think so. That would be sort of driven by intrinsic interest, curiosity, the
Yeah.
desire to understand what's the truth of these statements. So I think that is one kind. I think that's right. That's really powerful. As I were thinking, so that's one's personal desire. You care enough about this thing to seek the truth. I don't think we can see the truth of everything. So that's another thing he's not really talking about, is the motivational dimension. No one's critical thinking about everything. You'd crumble under that way of being in the world, I think. And I think that is the case. I think was it Aristotle said, those who can do, those who understand, teach. Not right. That's as a kind of knowing, but they also teach because they love it and they're interested and they care.
Right.
Probably that we can't separate those out. But I was wondering too, so you kind of give a positive sense. You care so much about it that you're willing to contravene your professor. And I also, I think it's also driven by a sense of self, like, oh, there's an opportunity for me to show off that I can critique that. Or what I was saying, my kind of, I want to maintain my agency and authority. So I think that can motivate it too.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think where it differentiates is that if you're motivated by the latter there, by your ego, asserting yourself for your ego, then I think you're less inclined to admit when you're wrong.
That's right.
I think with someone who's seeking the truth, when you're when someone shows you that you're wrong, I think you might struggle with that and feel bad, but ultimately you're thankful because, oh, great,
Yeah,
I don't,
that's right.
because and Kierkegaard actually talked a lot about this, like, because it was based on Socrates, you know, um, the greatest fear was to be in the wrong, or to be, trapped in an illusion. So, and so if you're in your own pursuits or going down the wrong path, if someone corrects you, like, oh my gosh, thank you so much, because now you're bringing me back towards
Right.
my goal of really knowing the truth. So I think, yeah, there's like ways in which we get in the way of ourselves, which I think is kind of like a motto for what we're all about, like how we get in the way of ourselves,
Mhm.
but, and it's
And
really, go ahead, please.
well, I was saying one of the ways we get in the way of ourselves is we put our sense of self in the way
Yeah,
of between what we're trying to figure out, the truth. So we're trying to win more than understand,
right.
for instance.
Yeah. And then it leads to these distortions because we're so trapped with the need to assert ourselves and protect our sense of selves and self-worth and whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
so it sounds Kierkegaard is saying that that's what Buddhism is saying, right?
yeah,
That if the sense, the self, these afflictions that we can't help but see through this lens. So I think we're getting to, I was like, okay, what's our angle on critical thinking? It's not in here. I've never read about it, but uh, I never read a self-worth or a sense of self or self-processes angle on critical thinking, but I've seen examples that made an impression on me. Again, I always look at this through the lens of the experiences of college students, because that's who I work with every day. So for instance, what does it take when you get a prompt from your professor? Okay, so John Stuart Mill said this, or Karl Marx said that. Critique. Like, who am I to, what are you talking
right,
about?
right,
What so yes, there's a cognitive challenge to that, and I which I promote, but I think it's not like socially, interpersonally, what is required to come to that task in the way that the professor wants,
hmm,
and do people have that, and what do people not have to do that they customarily do, one of which is something like, well, Dr. So and so, I think you're wrong. Like, what? We don't do that. Well, who does that? Who does that? No, judge, I think you're wrong. No, dad, I think no. Most people do not do that. That is not how we interpersonally go around in the world. Um, and so I've seen that. I experienced it myself, and I've read vignettes in which I'm like, oh, what's operating here is not an intellectual incapability; it's a social inhibition, which makes sense given people's upbringing. And we notice it more. We'll say, oh, well, yeah, the critical thinking, they're raised in a traditional Asian culture or Latino, they're highly uh, attentive to hierarchy and they would never contravene that. And
right,
Westerns are more egalitarian. That's
yep,
true in general, but in an individual, right? So, but you're getting at something that's crucial, right? If you're saying that's essential to a culture's critical thinking, then it's relevant to an individual's critical thinking. You're just not asking about that individual's relation to power and authority and
yep,
agency.
but then, yeah,
But clearly it's relevant, it seems to me.
yeah, yeah, I agree. Wow. All right. Um, okay, so then what does that mean? Like, what are we saying? Because so here's an
Yeah.
interesting point, which it seems like a paradox to me, where we're at. On the one hand, we're saying that, we do get in the way of ourselves. Like we tend to, in our want to protect our whatever sense of self and self-worth we have, we tend to be uncritical, or
Mm.
we tend to walk in and say, well, you're the professor, you tell me what I'm supposed to learn, and I'll just swallow it whole, spit it back, and get a good grade. That's not critical thinking at all. And then on the professor side, so there's, well, I'm teaching this, I've known this, and then I want students to kind of learn what I have to say in a way to affirm what I believe. And that, or I want to seem smart to my students, so they need to just kind of intellectually bow down and
Hmm.
take what I give them. I mean, that's not to say that's always going on, but that can go on. So both sides can be not really
Hmm.
exercising true critical thinking. So, so critical thinking does take this ability to kind of not protect yourself, to put yourself out there, to want something larger than yourself, which is the truth, the coherence. And so you have to yield yourself to that in ways that are put you in vulnerable situations, like
Right.
asking a question, or admitting you don't know, or challenging a professor, or all those kind of things. But that takes guts, that takes courage, so it takes a sense of self-worth. So do you see the paradox? Like, on the one hand, you're protecting your
Hmm.
self-worth, on the other hand, you need self-worth, or some level of self-esteem, so that you're willing to put yourself out there. So how do we solve that riddle?
Well, I think from a self-worth theory point of view, this is why intrinsic motivation figures so powerfully in those discussions, because the argument is something like, this is an oversimplification, of course, that if you're so curious and interested and fascinated, it overwhelms the inhibitions you feel to maintaining and defending your sense of self. You're so immersed in it, you lose yourself in the
Yeah.
activity. You're so into it that the relative significance of that fascination, interest, curiosity, with the need to protect yourself, it just tilts this balance. And then a related one is, how do you, and I think comes up. Students also, if we use that as a paradigm, the student, when they care so much, often for moral or other purposes, some cause, something, it's like something outside themselves. So it's not intrinsic in terms of curiosity, but it's deeply internalized, a value system, belief system, something they really care about. Then they're willing, again, that sense, that need to protect, both in the sense of self, but also even materially. Like, oh, I'm gonna get a bad grade. Well, I just can't. I have to say this. What are my senses, my principles, my ideals, what I think is right. And then I think, so it's not that we become, well, I'm not saying people aren't courageous, but sometimes it's not so much that we are now more courageous. It's just the dynamic shift. We don't have to be courageous if we care that much, and we're driven by ideals that are powerful. It's not about courage so much as we're powerful, courage to act against something. It's courage to act for something.
Right.
Right. So
Yeah.
even that, so that's another principle of self-worth theory. It's the immediate power of avoidance and fear and self-protection and defense against loss, right? So so the preservation instinct is super powerful. But we look around the world and people are constantly contravening that. Why? When they're curious and fascinated. Why? When they have a principle, an ideal that's big. And then in the face of that, it's a lot of times it just sort of happens. Then other times we can consciously say, I'm going to be brave, I'm going to be courageous. I think that's true too.
Mhm.
But so that's more of a psychological explanation, right? The
Yeah, no, but I think that's totally right. I mean, you get to this point where deep down, like what came to mind when you're thinking about that, and I think I've used this before, when I worked with the residential college advisors, the upperclassmen who were in charge of a particular area of the college where there were freshmen or first year students and sophomores. You would have like students struggling with some major issues, be it like a psychological issue, or like an eating disorder, and the RCAs were constantly like, "Oh, I want to do this for them. How do I help them?" And you're like, "Well, okay, we can provide the information, but at some point, they deep down have to say, I don't want to live like this anymore. I need help. There has to be this admission, and it's kind of this black box where you can create circumstances, but it's that individual it just has to happen for them, and you have to wait until then, and it's really, really hard. So similarly, you know, we can't teach that ability to be fascinated or whatnot, right? I
Right. So
mean,
remember at the beginning, I said it's not just teaching, it's learning.
yeah.
So I've been thinking about this a lot with respect to reading, but you bring a point there because I do want to come back to I think what your question to me was trying to send the sense of self. And so I want to go, and I answered it from a psychological level, motivation primarily.
Yeah.
And I want to put it back to you from an existential
Okay.
perspective. But so I've been thinking a lot about reading lately and teaching reading that's in the discussion. I know you have some experience with that, and particularly critical. So I was using critical reading or other kinds of reading. And that right now in higher ed, there's always this question like, what am I going to do for you as a student to help you or make you do X, Y, or Z? And I have a real sense of the limitations of that. I can teach whatever I want, but how you learn it and then what you do outside the class on your own, particularly in act like reading and reading complicated, extended discourse, you're spending hours and hours thinking about and you're trying to process, like that's a really complicated, orchestrated, purposeful act. How can I intervene in that as your teacher?
Hmm.
Not much, especially if you don't really want to.
Right.
So I think we underestimate the importance of the intention of the actor, of the agent, and the moment to moment. And I've started raising it explicitly with students. So in reading, we talk about purpose setting, but I think there's something different. So purpose is more like goal. Like, what do I want to achieve? Intention is moment to moment. What am I trying to do right now? I'm not trying to do anything. I'm just in class. I'm trying to get the reading done. Okay, well, that intention is not going to generate critical thinking. You're complying. No, I'm not disrespecting the students. That's what I did. I was mostly, but the point I'm trying to get at is like, so teaching critical thinking. Well, the amount, and Willingham does say it's self-directed, but I think that needs to be expanded. So number one, it includes the word self. So how would we get in the way of being self-directed? But what's involved in being self-directed? I think much more than that little term suggests. And some of it is particularly in the world now where people have such short attention spans that literally minute to minute, our attention is being fragmented. And if our attention is, then our intention is. And it's not new in human experience, but it's magnified. Is this making sense? And that as an instructor, as a teacher, it's quite difficult to be able to impact people's intentions, particularly complicated ones. And in fact, I would argue we don't want to be, because then we're taking control of people at an even greater level. Think about it. Do you want your professor and your teachers influencing your kids' moment to moment intention? I think that's really scary, actually. Now, you imagine some benevolence and, well, they're just wanting them to learn and critical thinking. You're teaching the intention to think critically, but yeah, I don't know. And I'm not some conspiracy theory. I'm just saying, I think that the knowledge of our understanding of human cognition is very powerful. We have to be careful. Right. So this points back to jumping to the end, like how do you learn critical thinking? I think so. I'll jump to that in just a second. I do want to come back to you. It's like we have to be careful not to think we can teach all of critical thinking and that we should take that on. I think we want to be saying something like we want to create conditions where people want to think critically because they're fascinated, because it matters to them, right? Because there's some utility in this. They care, they have a stake. They don't agree with what you're saying, and they have a reason and a desire to do something about that, to persuade you or to think, to explore, to try to answer for themselves. Why don't I agree? Rather than I'm going to go in there and turn on your critical thinking switch. I don't think you can do it, and I don't think we should try to do it as educators. But And maybe that goes back to the sense of self, that that would mean that the individual is giving over more and more to somebody else, what they're
Right.
trying to do, their purpose, their meanings. Yeah.
Yeah,
I know that was quite a tangent, man. Sorry. I
no,
don't
no,
think I
no, no.
set you up very well.
No, but I think I don't know if we're doing the existential stuff per se, but I kept thinking about, the idea of fascination, like, and like, you're right. I mean, I think there's in a sense you can't necessarily teach that. You can model it though, at the very least.
Hmm. Absolutely.
And I think that's something that I look at, at all my teachers. Rare was the person that it was like, okay, we're gonna, let's study this today, and off they go, and they just blah blah blah. There were then there were the professors who really did point to something beyond themselves, who didn't really care what you thought of them. They were just so fascinated with their subject that they really wanted to and just their whole attitude and posture modeled that fascination. And I think I think it's more likely that a student will be gripped by that. Be like, oh, like my professor's not up there worrying about, are they, do the students think I'm smart, and oh, I'm showing off what I know. Or I know professors who were up there and they were up there in front of the students arguing against another professor in the department. They didn't say their name, but it was obvious. I knew as a preceptor or whatever, like, oh, they're just tackling this
Right.
person's position over here. They could care less what the students, at that moment, they
Right.
could care less what the students thought. And then the students, so that in a way that the professor is drawing attention to themselves. I'm not saying that's always the case, but that's really what's happening.
Hmm.
Versus students are trying to deflect, like, I don't want any attention on myself, whatever. I think, but that's done for themselves, for self-protection, and in both cases, it's really the selves that are on the line, and so
Hmm.
and again, I think there, from an existential point of view, there's this idea, there's this bigger world out there, and a world that really can be awe-inspiring. And so how do we model that um, by the subject matter? So, that, I just finished this month, half year course on machine learning and AI business applications. And I tell you, with the machine learning, it's like you look at this data set and it can be kind of boring, but there's like, oh my gosh, there's a story here that
Mm.
you can tell, and it can really have very practical applications. And I kind of dive into it. I get fascinated. I'm like, oh my gosh, look what we can say. I find that very fascinating. Um,
Hmm.
and
And
so I think
relevant. You said it's practical.
it's practical, right? And so, yeah, to some people, it's going to be super boring, but I just am, you know,
Well, I might say,
wired.
can I say something else?
Yeah,
I'd say with some people's framing, with some people's motivations, because those words you're just describing, I would say are frames. What's the story? I think that's pretty interesting to most people,
yeah, yeah. I think
right? Well,
I
how
think
is this
the
practical? That's pretty relevant. And most people value that, but they're not analyzing the data set with these tools as a way to do that.
right, right.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. I like that. Now I know, like museums and whatnot, and art. Like, I know that some art I find inspiring, but generally I'm just not like the person you want to take to a museum. I'd rather be outside playing some game, or like doing something physical or whatever. Um, I don't know. So I think you're more inclined as
Yeah.
individuals to
Sure.
various fields. Um, but I do feel like there's this yield. I like this. Let me go. Michael Polanyi, who we've talked about, and also Iris Murdoch. I don't know if remember her. She's a philosopher from like mid 20th century, novelist as well. Both staunch atheists. I think I've made this point before, but they were fascinated with mystics, and I think primarily Christian mystics, but mystics of any religious type, because they had an openness to the world that others didn't. And I think that was predicated on this yielding on themselves, like they this death to self, and trying to not have the self become this wall that protects us and keeps us the other, try to maintain control, because the other is a threat to a certain degree. They didn't. They were increasingly were less self-protective and were yielding themselves. So they had this openness and a way of a perspective on the world that they found really attractive. And both of them were Iris Murdoch and Michael Polanyi, were really interested in the nature of discovery and how we come to know things, not in an epistemological way, but I mean, just the nature of discovery. Anyway, I think that is the existential core, perhaps here is
Mhm.
the struggle of the self, and can we, as you said, you put it, get so fascinated by a subject that we're more inclined to yield ourselves to something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah. Well, let me pick up on that and be a critical thinker about critical thinking.
Okay.
So, for instance, I think so. There's the discourse is, well, students aren't critical thinkers and they don't want to do it because it's effortful. There's very little self-reflexivity on teaching and saying, are we creating structures that actually inhibit critical thinking? So, Prince's, students I hear say, I'm so busy doing the work, I don't have time to learn. Well, whether that's true or not, exactly how that's the case, I don't know, but I've heard it enough to say, maybe we've created some conditions that, and he does say this, like you can't have so much content, right, that you can't immerse yourself deeply to think critically.
Hmm.
So if you're trying to cover so much and then say, why aren't they thinking critically about all this? Like as an instructor or teacher, you've created an obstacle, I think. And so that's one thing. Another thing I think you were getting at is, so this is kind of a so what of our conversation. And I'm weaving in, I'm sort of places I'm agreeing and disagreeing. So a point I'm going to be thinking critically. I think there's this assumption that critical thinking is just an unalloyed good. It is definitely not. In the university, it's mostly good, but not in introductory biology or economics. Why should we, statistics? I mean, I remember asking this to a friend of mine who was a statistician. I said, so why should we care about central tendency, which is the mean, the mode, and
Right, right, right.
and he's like, what? Well, your whole system is based upon central tendency, and like, why should we care about that? He was just like, and he didn't say, oh, what a great question. He said, you're really stupid, basically, which it was a friend, it's fine. But the point is, that's critical thinking. That's actually not a very useful question for anybody in Psych 1 and Stats 101. If you're working at McDonald's at the cash register and you have an insight about a better system for distributing the food and quicker to the people, and you say, hey, manager, I've got this better system for moving product, what are they going to say? Shut up and what are you talking about? Do your thing. So this idea that critical thinking is just a good, I think this is not so. And also a third example of that is I think students are thinking critically lots of time, but just not about the things, as I said before, that we want them to be thinking about, or the ways that we want them to. So I just want to put that in. It's just sort of thought it's good. People should do it. They don't do it enough. And the reason they don't do it is because of the students. And, that seems very self-serving on the part of the institutions and the instructors. And I'm a professor, so I'm clearly a critical thinker. I've worked with enough professors on teaching to know they are not critical thinkers about teaching. That
Right.
is not true. There are no more critical thinkers about teaching than students are about learning. This is just not true. And so that tells me something about what expertise allows you. And so that is the real reason I really believe that this transferable, domain specific, we have really, really smart people who believe whatever the latest article said about teaching. Like, I've been doing this a long time. No one study is going to do that. Plus, you don't even know, anyway. So, and it's not exactly a critique of the professors. It's just the nature of human knowledge or the most common disposition. So, I want to be a little more critical than Willingham is, even though I think he does some useful distinction.
Hmm.
And that matters to the so what of this, because we're challenged to come back to so what. I think your point about, yes, we need to have, if you want people to think critically, you need, as an instructor, you need to model the process of critical thinking explicitly. And Willingham exactly says this.
Right.
And that is different than modeling my product that's so smart
Right.
to you,
Right.
right? There's a subtle difference there of me pointing out how I analyze this passage or this problem, and me flourishing how I solved it or what the analysis is. Now, the student can reverse engineer that, but it's much harder. And I think this is where these, I think you used the word before, the objectives diverge. Do I want to make an analysis to show you how smart I am? Do I make an analysis to empower you to make your own? There's a lot of subtlety there.
Right. And I think also, I mean, I think I don't want to be so critical of professors because on one hand, they could really care about the students and not so much about being
Mm,
smart. But it could still be the case. Well, they design the course as, okay, here's the body of knowledge you need to know,
it's typically what they do.
and they just kind of they're just kind of
Mhm.
plowing through it, and that in itself I think is inadequate
That's right. We
because
call that coverage.
yeah, okay, yeah, coverage, because then it's just like, okay, yeah, I need to know this,
The
if
prime
it's
imperative. I got to cover this.
right, yeah, like computer science is like, I find that seemed to be how the courses were done. Just,
Mhm.
yeah, we're just plowing through everything, just, at light speed. And yeah, and to the student's point, there was no time to become fascinated with the subject because you were just so busy trying to, keep up.
Well, can I
Yeah.
give an example? So,
Yeah.
because I've been doing this, I wrote a book on with faculty, and they'd say, "Well, but I have to do the coverage," and I'd say, "Okay, do you value the skills? Do you value the ways of thinking? Yes. Are you covering them?
Right.
No.
Right.
So that's not critical thinking.
Yeah.
You just assume coverage means the conceptual content, not the procedural knowledge and skills. Because you laid out these goals and objectives, I want to be able to think critically, be able to do these things. Okay, are you covering those adequately? And 99% of the time, it's like, right, they just place that outside the in a different category, and so that's an assumption, right? That
Yeah.
wasn't examined. That's relevant to their domain, but not to teaching it.
Right.
So that's what. So I think. So I think you're right. And I'm sympathetic. Like, you are supposed to cover a bunch of stuff, or you want to equip people to learn it on their own. See, that's where I come in, because you can't cover it all in class. You only meet 3 hours a week. But then if the student isn't equipped, empowered, and motivated to learn it on their own, then that seems like the time they're going to learn it. Then you are really forced to lecture so fast that you're covering everything. I think that's happening quite a bit, actually.
Yeah. I
And I'm
know.
sympathetic to that.
I know we got to call it quits here. I have two questions or a question for you. I hope that's okay to ask. But before
Mhm.
that, I was interesting because when you talked about, I was thinking about when I was coaching a lot of youth baseball, and there is a coverage temptation because you're like, okay, they're going to kind of graduate from my teaching up to the next level. So how do I make sure
Right.
that this, and this? And it was interesting. And this will sound, like I'm praising myself, and but I always was like, well, how do I help them understand the game so the context of what I'm teaching them makes sense? So, like, one of the first things, and this was just me coming from the outside, and 'cause I think so many of the fathers who taught were like, okay, they got to learn this, and this, and I was like, well, why do they have to? And so I remember one thing in youth
You're wanting to
baseball,
understand the system, the game. Yeah.
yeah, just something big, larger context. So, um, for the kids on my team, the fundamental lesson they had to learn was when was the ball alive and when was it dead?
Hmm. Wow.
And and then it's interesting because most people don't teach that. So if we're on offense and the ball is still alive, my kids are running the bases because your kids aren't paying attention. And so like as soon as the catcher picks it up, if he's got his back turned, the ball's not dead; it's still alive. It's not. I mean, the ball is dead when the pitcher's in position, the catcher's in position. That's when it's dead. So until that point, you could probably run.
I
On
did not know
defense,
that.
yeah. I mean, that's youth baseball. And it's actually true for pro ball.
Yeah.
That's why, like, they're always calling timeout. If you watch a pro game, it's like they
Right.
call time all the time. Like, I remember one time,
To make sure these things don't happen.
right? And
People
that's
not
where
exploiting that. Yeah.
I remember one time we were in a district game, and the catcher caught the ball and walked out to the pitcher. My kid was on third base, took off and stole home. And the other coach was like, "What do you mean, my coach?" And I said, "You never called timeout. Ball's still alive."
Yeah.
And the umpire's like, "You're absolutely right. We scored a run." I mean, and I was like, "You didn't teach your kids."
It's an unthinking convention.
Right. Now,
There's an
and again,
assumption that as soon as you do that, then that's happened, but it didn't happen.
oh yeah, like it was funny. My kids, I had like 8, 9-year-olds. So when we were on defense, the key was to kill the play. And what that meant was, like in youth baseball, if people are running, the ball's getting thrown all over the place,
Right.
right? So I taught my kids, my players, I said, if we don't make that first play, we kill the play. We get the ball till it's dead, so no one can advance. And so
Right.
if whether or not we made that first play, all my kids on the field were always like, kill the play, kill the play. And so they had this larger context to
Yeah.
understand so I don't
I
know.
love it. Frawley ball.
What's that?
Frawley ball.
Well, yeah, it was like somewhat controversial, to be honest. I wasn't necessarily beloved in the town because, my kids were running,
Yeah.
stealing bases left and right. I mean, they loved it because it gave them a sense of the play. It was interesting. There was a, like, I don't know I know this is getting off topic, but it
Well,
was, it's fun. Like, there was some of the other coaches were not happy because my kids would be stealing a lot of bases. And I was like, well, baseball is a game of controlled, smart aggression. Like you have to be aggressive when you're going to field a grounder. You have to be aggressive when you're catching a pop-up line. You have to be aggressive, especially at the plate. That's the hardest place to be aggressive because that ball's coming at you and it hurts if it hits you. So I said, where's the easiest place for me to teach aggression? It's running bases. So if I can get kids aggressive on the bases, then they're going to be better on defense and better at the plate. And it's true. And so I wasn't like necessarily trying to like run up the score, or I mean, I wanted to win. I'm competitive, but a lot of people didn't appreciate that. So, and point where it came up to the league, the board, they wanted to stop all stealing bases at a certain level. And the night before it happened, I remember Greg Maddux was, the pitcher, Greg Maddux, he was walked. And then he immediately stole second base because the other folks, they didn't call timeout and no one covered second from the walk, and so he just kind of started walking and then boom, took off and stole second. And I said, that's my point.
Yeah.
They were like, oh, this is some real baseball. And I said, Greg Maddux just proved me right.
Yeah. Well,
And
here's my take on that, and it
yeah,
relates to this. So you're trying to understand the deep structure of the game, of the system. So, and then your critical thinking helps you figure out how to intervene in a way that helps you helps you achieve the objective of the game, and knowing the particulars of the domain. So Little League Baseball is different in that your controlled aggression puts pressure on the other person. And we've all seen, they even talk about it when the MLB has these throws going crazy. They're like, oh, it's like Little League Baseball. We've
right,
all seen that. So
right,
number one, you're like, that's a place to get bases, to move around the right. That's a way to get bases that also doesn't hurt anybody, right? They're not getting beamed by a ball. It's not like taking, whatever. So I appreciate that. It is aggressive. It's not like aggressive to the detriment of somebody else
right,
physically. Um, Secondly, then your defensive strategy plays on that too. It's like, well, they're not so great, these 9-year-olds, when they're under pressure and they're throwing the ball and they're out of the, they're doing this thing. Like, let's not do that. Let's kill the play. And that's so that people don't get cheap free bases, right? Basically. I mean, that's Billy Ball to me. And it's based on a deep understanding. And then you added something that I've never heard before. Okay, baseball is controlled aggression. You had a longer definition, but you use that term to guide your strategizing. So that's not so different to me than thinking about physics from Newton's 3 laws. Newton says the world, you can understand all physical action and mechanisms and these 3 laws. What are they? How do they work? What did we mean by this word precisely? Aggression. What does that mean? What does aggression mean on this base? Where would I use that? I think so. You're saying this is an example of critical thinking that yields a benefit. I think it's true. And then we can say, that's what Billy Ball was based on too. Saber, like, how should we think about baseball?
right.
Let's not think about baseball the way that people have in the past, because I don't think it works very well. There's some these advanced statistics are doing that in basketball and in football. They're saying, points, average points per game isn't the best way to think about basketball if you want to win, right? That's what they said with Billy Ball. It's a different lens, critical, kind of going below the surface, going below what's assumed. Of course, the player who has more home, whatever, RBIs is better. No, that's dependent on somebody else. I've seen Billy Ball too many times. But so that's based on a different model of the domain that you're seeing. And I see it utterly consistent. I think that's why you're bringing it up, right?
Yeah, I mean, in the end, I'm not going to say I was some saint. That was far from it. I had my issues as a father, and I was very competitive. I won't deny that, but I can't tell you the joy I had when you saw a kid who was not a star player, who stole that base, became a contributor, and really helped out the team. That was, and I don't know, there's a joy about that, and so there was a fascination. I think that we could to get to that point where they became more. There was more joy about baseball and willingness to learn because, yeah, they just I don't know they saw
Well,
they really yeah. Go ahead.
I would say they saw that it worked.
Yeah, yeah,
So that's, to use Willingham's words, it's effective.
yeah.
The insights that you made pointed to interventions that were effective. And then feels good to be effective. Feels
Yeah.
good to have efficacy. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm oversimplifying, but
Well, I just not to I know we're getting short on time. Is there time for me to ask you a
yeah.
question? Because this is when we were preparing for this, I was thinking about this, and I'm going to push you onto thin ice here a little bit.
Okay.
Liberal arts education
Right.
and critical thinking. It seems to be one of the hopes, dreams, um, for a liberal arts education is you're developing critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
Somehow being, well, I think there's, that's one way. I mean, being exposed to different fields of study will somehow develop this, more generalized ability to be a critical thinker. Thoughts on that?
Well, I think you used two key words that I would have: exposure somehow. Right. So
Right,
somehow learning Latin makes you a logical thinker, right?
right.
So it's deeply built, and that's a liberal arts education. So this belief that creating a curriculum with a bunch of smart people in different disciplines and having students wend their way through these courses leads to critical thinking, I think, is not reflected in the research and the data. It's an assumption. And so and that isn't the case. So, I've made the distinction between having an institution having a liberal arts curriculum, courses and departments, and then a student getting a liberal arts education. So I think there's a couple things. One is the student as an adult in a college or university has to have that. They have to go get an education. They're not getting educated. And so this is the agency piece. But I think there's a second part, which we've been talking about before too, which is you actually, so I think that critical thinking in part comes from recognizing the limitations of any approach to knowledge, right? That's this disposition. Well, economics or psychology has come at these topics in a particular way, and they're pretty smart people and they're making some insights, but they're grounded in particular assumptions and methods and ways of doing things, and that these are always limited. They empower us and they give us, and that, I think this is what we're talking about. We understand the relativeness of knowledge from the discipline. And that's a big part of liberal arts education. It's comparative, it's relative, but you have to immerse yourself deep enough, number one, to see that, to recognize that. And then the people teaching you have to be willing to say the limitations of their approach. They have to unpack the assumptions and frameworks. And then especially they have to model, as you were saying before, the process for most people to get it, I think. Can students who are really into it kind of do that on their own, or does every single professor have to do it? So I think and it's not happening in part because of the coverage imperative.
Right.
It's not happening because instructors don't agree that that's what students need, right? Or they're not skillful in doing that. But I would think that if you're saying what's the recipe for getting a liberal arts education, and then the outcomes of that, one of which is critical thinking, is you have to have enough immersion in the process of creating knowledge and reasoning and thinking, and that's really hard to do on your own as an individual who's 18 or 19 years old without some, not just coverage or even guidance, but modeling, explicit modeling. And then there's a lot that goes back to the agency of the learner. If they don't want to learn at that level for any number of reasons, then I don't think it's possible for me to instill in you, right, a caring and appreciation, a curiosity, and the complicated mental processes to orchestrate critical thinking, particularly when it's new to you. So that's right. Critical thinking is effortful. So if you don't really want it, it's going to be really hard for me to incentivize that much effort. So Willingham says it's effortful, it's taxing, it's often unpleasant. So I think it's truly the interaction. And, I think a lot of students actually don't know what a liberal arts education is, and they don't want it. Now, there's some that do, and then they most of the time can get it. They usually have to not always though, because they're so busy doing other things. But is that answering your question?
Yeah, no, just curious what your thoughts on that were, just given, university settings. I know, yeah, like I said, a lot of students, they just kind of want to focus on what they want to focus on. And so being required to take classes in other fields seems like a waste of time. And so it's easy just to kind of put in, minimal effort to get whatever grade you need and then move on, versus which is counter to the ideal espoused by liberal arts institutions.
Yeah, I think we want students to be able to adopt different paradigms and lenses and theoretical frameworks that are associated with different disciplines, and that's it's across them. But to be able to do that, including critical thinking and analytically, it's actually much harder than people think.
Right.
Including people teaching them. That's kind of the premise of Willingham. Like, critical thinking doesn't come from coverage. It doesn't come just from knowing things. It's indispensable to know things, but it's not sufficient. Right. And then what are these other things? Processes, questioning, investing deep effort. Well, lots of things get in the way of that. And so I think it's quite hard to achieve a liberal arts education.
Right. No, it's a good point, because I know, like, some of the writing I've been doing lately has this one Christian writer in mind who's a psychiatrist, and a lot of Christian thinking in the circles I run, we take psychology as kind of like a starting point, but there's no questioning of what are the assumptions and what's the limitations. Like, they are so great in this, but you have to know where they exceed their bounds, and do they have a comprehensive view of human nature? And I would say no. And this is where Jim Loder, who was a trained psychologist, who I've mentioned, who is my kind of intellectual and spiritual mentor when I was in seminary, but he was dead on accurate about this, and just saying, it's limited. It's not to say we discard what they have to say. It's like, how do you take it in a larger theological context? And so, but it's not like psychologists are running around telling you, hey, wait a minute, we have certain assumptions and here are limitations in our thought. That's who does
that's
that?
Right. They're not being self-reflectively critical.
Right.
Well, I'm going to take a shot across the bow of another discipline that I think is way too big for its britches, which is neuroscience. That's all I'm going to say. Maybe we'll come back to that another time. But in my view, we have this assumption that's not examined critically. If you study people's brains, and you know something about human beings, and you know something about their minds, and it's just not true. And we're not there yet as a field in neuroscience, not even close, and we'll never be, because humans' actions are not reducible to their brains. But that's an unexamined assumption, and I would argue, in part, not held seemingly by a lot of neuroscientists.
It becomes definitive and all-encompassing.
Right.
And well, then and we can get into it, because then it becomes, well, what self-referentially incoherent, because what about your own efforts? I have to say, whatever.
Self-referentially incoherent. Wow, that's cool. All right. Thanks, Matt.
Well, can we just really quickly, I know you gotta go. If you had to say anything like, okay, we like, this sounds great, the fascination, all that stuff. But let's say I'm kind of this professional in my job. I'm tired of doing decks for my investment banking company or management consulting or engineering, whatever, or I'm a student, who's overwhelmed with my work. Like, you're like, oh, it's so hard to, critical thinking. I know I
Yeah.
need it, but what, like, real quickly, what's your so what, or what's your advice to them?
So advice about becoming maybe more of a critical thinker.
Critical thinker, or just like, okay, it's a skill we that's important. The ability to unearth assumptions. Be
Hmm.
somewhat your own, even about your own beliefs and whatnot, and how to
Yeah.
think critically, to judge
Yeah.
one opinion versus another. What how
I'd say I think the first thing comes to mind is to seek the deep organizational structure of the domain, not just the surface, but the deep organizational structure of the knowledge of the domain. And my own knowledge is both practical and useful because it allows you to transfer and do things with that other people can't.
right.
And so that appeals to the utilitarian motivation, but it's also fascinating and yields a kind of understanding and coherence we often have a deep desire for. Um, and then that often has a kind of satisfaction too, an enjoyment to that. So um, and have that, and I can consciously adopt the desire and the intention to understand something deeply. I can choose to do that.
Hmm.
I can set out to say, but why and how? And that this is not contradictory to something that's practical. So Kurt Lewin said, "There's nothing so practical as a good theory." I firmly believe that. Um, so and it's not incompatible to want to understand something theoretically and practically. And I think this is a false dichotomy.
Yeah, I was just gonna mention that, the asking why is, a great question. It can lead to, wandering that's uncomfortable, because a lot of people just kind of get on with life. They're on the hamster
Hmm.
trail. They're just running, 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 and there's a certain comfort in that when you don't think critically or think deeply about things. But it's ultimately, I think, unsatisfying. So we're all wired, I think, to think deeply, to live in a state of awe and fascination. Not necessarily always, but just to be fascinated by things. And so it's a question of how do you, where can you
Mm.
find that? And I think it is possible. Like, again, I just happen to be wired where I find machine learning, AI stuff fascinating. It's not my only fascination, but I'm working on a, um, problem set, right, data set right now, and it's on shipping supply lines, and it's like, am I really that interested in shipping? Not really. But then, like I said, it tells a story, and I find it fascinating to see what we can and cannot say. That's just me. And I mean, obviously, I'm, Kierkegaard, and there's other fields that I find fascinating, and I think it's just a matter of pursuing those. But I think even in our work, there's ways to pursue it. You just have to kind of want it initially, and think about it.
Right. So I'm always in, I mean, I'm going to pick up one more thought. So I'm always interested in what an individual can do to intervene in their own experience through their volition to
Right.
change behavior. So
Right.
I would say there's a crucial step there. You're saying you're wired. I would say there's maybe that could be. Also, what I hear is there's ways you're framing the task and the activity and the data and what you're doing. It's a story. I'm curious about the pattern. I think at some level you're like, what could we do with this? Not That's not how everybody is framing looking at data sets, and that these matter, that those frames map very specifically onto what we know about what motivates people,
Right.
right? So that correspondence tells me that this is significant. And I wouldn't say, maybe in your case it's relatively automatic, right? Now, but that doesn't mean you can't choose it.
Relatively automatic. What's automatic?
Like, you didn't have to say, I'm going to think about what the story is here. That you
Right.
just frame it that way. What's the
Right. Right.
story?
Right.
But you could tell yourself, I want to think about this in terms of the story not the columns and rows, right? Because
Right.
columns and rows are not very exciting, but stories are kind of, for most people, are kind of interesting. And then at some level, you can know yourself and
Yep.
say, well, the story isn't so important, but the relevance and utility is really interesting to me. What could I do with this if I approach it in a different way? And so I think what happens, a lot of people are doing that when they're fascinated, they just do that automatically,
Yeah.
unthinkingly.
Yep.
And then they say, I guess that's just me.
Right.
Or can't you see it? It's obvious. It's a
Right.
story. It's a story waiting to be told. And you're like, no, I see rows and columns.
Right.
And that's a way of seeing. It's a way of thinking. And I'm going to call framing.
Right. No, that's a good point. And I just want to go back. I say we're wired that way because that leads to life becomes dissatisfying or unsatisfying, sorry, when we're not doing that. And so that's points that
Right.
we are wired, because that's when life seems to have a richness that it didn't have previously. So I hold that firmly. So that's what creates this restlessness often when we're in what we see as a dead end job or whatever, because we just can't find that there's not a fascination or awe
Right.
in that. So I want to be careful about that, but I do.
Well,
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm reacting to the metaphor. So the wiring is the engineer, it's the neuroscience metaphor.
Yeah,
What a
true. Okay.
psychologist would say is you have a need and a drive.
Right. Yeah.
It may look something like a neurocircuit or not, but
No,
whatever.
it's a good point. Yeah, I used it. Anyway,
Super common. Super common.
What's that?
It's super common.
Yeah. Well, that was great. I was curious. I feel like we always go on a journey on these talks. I'm not sure where, but it's so illuminating. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, until next time.
All right, take care.